Good morning. My name is Noriyuki Shikata. I'm Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs at the Prime Minister's Office. I'm at the same time Director of Global Communications at the Japanese Prime Minister's Office. Today I would like to discuss the issues related to Japan's efforts in terms of reconstruction after 3/11, focusing on some of the Japanese economic policy measures. And also, since Prime Minister Noda is attending the APEC summit meeting after attending G20 summit meeting in Cannes, France, I'd like to touch upon some of the issues related to international economic or financial matters. And since today we have, I guess, more embassy people than the international journalists, I guess after receiving some questions from international press, I would be delighted to receive some of the embassy's people's questions, if there are any. So let me just get into some of the issues. Of course, today, there's so much attention, paid to what the Prime Minister might be saying, possibly later this afternoon, with regard to TPP. I would just kind of back off a little bit and discuss broader pictures of the kind of policy environment that the Prime Minister Noda is in, and what kind of issues that he intends to address. And here, as you see in the PowerPoint presentation, Japan's reconstruction and international economic policy under Noda administration, I will be touching upon three major issues. One is recovery and reconstruction from the quake, and number two is response to economic challenges, that's both domestic and international. And number three is Japanese foreign economic policy, especially in relation to the APEC, upcoming APEC meeting. Just getting into the first issue regarding the recovery and reconstruction from the disaster. Of course, since most of you are living in Tokyo, you are probably feeling that there is a very quick recovery from the disaster. And of course, we have seen slowing down of the economy in the first quarter and the second quarter. But as far as we foresee in the future, we are seeing rather robust growth in the third quarter and fourth quarter, namely 5.3% GDP growth for the third quarter and 2.3% for the fourth quarter for this year. And if you look at the international organizations' forecasts, like IMF, Japan's real economic growth rate is expected, to be higher than the United States or Eurozone area, which is for Japan 2.3%, for the United States 1.8%, and the Eurozone 1.1%. Of course, there are changing policy environments, and those forecasts could be, somewhat affected. At the same time, the infrastructure that was damaged due to quake and tsunami on the 11th of March has been repaired to a large extent. And as an example, Tohoku Expressway or Sendai Airport were back in operation within a month. And as we see supply chains recovery, it's pretty much close to the full restoration in the month of by the month of September or October. And of course, this quick recovery is assisted by the series of supplementary budgets, and we are implementing the first and second supplementary budget, which totals 6 trillion yen, and right now there is an ongoing deliberation at the budget committees of the Japanese Parliament regarding a third supplementary budget, which is 12 trillion yen, or a little over $150 billion. And of course, this third supplementary budget is shifting from the recovery to reconstruction. We try to kind of distinguish between the two words in terms of recovery, repairing some of the damages, but in terms of reconstruction, we wish to create something new in terms of based on the policy recommendations that we received from Reconstruction Design Council, headed by Professor Yokibe of the President of National Defense Academy. And moving on to the next slide, reconstruction open to the world. We have been saying, upon receiving recommendations from Reconstruction Design Council, that our reconstruction process should be open to the international community. And in fact, in order to have a viable reconstruction program or process, it is very important for international expertise, international companies to participate in the process of reconstruction. And at the same time, we are aware of the need to share the lessons learned from the disaster and the reconstruction with the international community, trying to introduce a new policy instruments such as special zones for reconstruction, and as is quoted in the right hand of the quote of a policy speech by Prime Minister Noda, the Japanese government is introducing the measures exempting companies from paying corporate tax for 5-year period in the special zones for reconstruction. And this applies to foreign companies as well. And there is a ongoing deliberation about accepting highly skilled foreign workers, or free trade agenda is deemed closely related to the revitalization of the Japanese economy. And the next slide touches upon the issue of a nuclear power station, the TEPCO's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And at this venue, at the Foreign Press Center of Japan, I have been engaged in the series of briefings with the colleagues from other ministries regarding the status of TEPCO's Fukushima Daiichi. Some of the salient points include cold shutdown of the reactors aimed by the end of this year. There is the large-scale decontamination operations being implemented, and the needs, we are aware of the need to fully disclose information related to the dispersal of radioactive materials, including the more strengthened monitoring of radioactive materials. And there has been the review of evacuation policy as the condition has gradually improved, as you are aware. Moving on to the next pillar, that's related to the response to economic challenges. as you are aware, Prime Minister Noda attended the G20 Cannes summit meeting, which focused on the Greece issues or Eurozone issues. And the Prime Minister Noda was saying in Cannes that it is important to create a sustainable and credible framework to fundamentally resolve the government debt issues or sovereign debt issues. Of course, there needs to be stabilization of financial system, and also we have to be attentive to the possibility of prevent the contagion issues, not only inside Eurozone but beyond Eurozone. Of course, Japan highly regards the agreement reached among European leaders, and we hope that the agreement will be steadily implemented based on leadership by European leaders. And we regard the strong unity of Europe is essential. And Japan wishes to consider necessary cooperation or assistance, since this issue is something that has a direct bearings upon the Japanese economy or the global economy, and that's something we need to work together. And there is another the separate or the associated issues of EFSF, and it is very important for European efforts to regain the credibility in the marketplace. And we have been, as you are aware, purchasing EFSF bonds in the future, and Mr. Noda mentioned that Japan intends to continue to do so. As for the Japanese economy, as I mentioned at the outset, we are expecting a relatively high growth in Japan, but the currency, the appreciation of yen has been emerging as an issue that could present a downside risk. So we are of the view that the excess volatility and disorderly movements in exchange rates have adverse implications for economic and financial stability, which is actually the sentence coming from a communique of G20. And we think that it is important to promote cooperation for stability in the exchange rates, and which we think should reflect the economic fundamentals. And there is associated emerging markets issues, and if contagion to emerging economies would take place, it would be damaging not only to those countries but the global economy as a whole, because emerging economies are the driving force for the world economy. And we are of the view that it is necessary to prepare a response, including IMF facility or regional arrangements to support those economies. And as an example, when Prime Minister Noda went to Seoul, there was agreement reached between Japan and the Republic of Korea that we would expand currency swap arrangement with between the two countries to $70 billion. Moving on to the next slide, this is a speech made by Prime Minister Noda at G20 at what they call B20. So G20 countries' business leaders represented, and he shared some of the lessons from the Japanese economy, especially during the period of late 90s, when we were confronted with major financial institutions facing the massive difficulties, and some of those institutions that are found to be in capital deficit, they went into the liquidation proceedings, which is really important to separate those institutions that are viable and those who are not. And if they are found to be potentially viable, there is a legitimate reason to inject public funds. So, of course, this was a very painful experiences. At the same time, there are lessons to be learned in terms of how we would try to keep and maintain the health of financial system. And we think that it is important to keep appropriate balance between financial regulation and surveillance. Moving on to, just skip next slide and moving on to the countermeasures to yen appreciation and hollowing out. This is something that was decided by the Japanese government as a cabinet decision in terms of the government's response to yen's appreciation. And the following point, including maintaining the stability of markets and selecting effective policies to respond to yen's appreciation, and minimizing pain and maximizing merits of the yen's appreciation, and the producing results through progress management, agenda for new growth. These are the major principles that are included in the plan. You could pay particular attention to the discussion of some of the issues like maximizing the merits of the yen appreciation. Of course, many of export-oriented companies suffer from yen's appreciation, and we are aware of a potential risk of hollowing out Japanese companies relocating their manufacturing base from Japan to overseas. But at the same time, there are the potential or opportunities for promoting foreign M&A or acquisition of natural resources by making use of the yen's appreciation. And also we are discussing as a related issues, for example, sending Japanese students abroad or accepting high-skilled personnel from abroad and those kind of issues. So there is the comprehensive efforts to overcome the current situation, and this is going to be ongoing, and this is a very important issue to tackle for Noda administration. And moving on to the next slide, this slide discusses the issue of achieving both economic and fiscal health, which means fiscal consolidation. And we are discussing in terms of three paths, which is path of cutting expenditures, path of increasing revenues, and path of revenue reform. And as an example of cutting expenditures, for example, the issue of cutting personnel costs for national civil servants is included. Or in terms of increasing revenues, there's intensive discussions ongoing in terms of revival of food, agriculture, forestry, and fishery industries, which is related to our discussions on free trade agreements. And also, there is the newly established Council on National Strategy and Policy, which is going to compile a basic strategy for revitalizing our country by the end of the year. And we are stepping up efforts to compile our new strategy based on new growth strategy that has been introduced under the DPG administration. But in light of what has been happening after 3/11, we are updating and also fundamentally reviewing our potential for the new path for economic growth. And of course, there is an issue of revenue reform, including the increasing tax rates and reviewing taxation policy. The next slide addresses the energy policy review. You are probably already aware of the government's announcement to review or revise from scratch the current basic energy policy, which covers until 2030. For example, the current basic energy policy includes the numerical target of over 50% of power generation to be generated by nuclear, which is now basically given up, and we are moving toward reducing dependence on nuclear power generation. But at the same time, how are we going to fill the gap in terms of power generation, for example? And obviously, this discussion involves how we could promote saving energy, how we could promote deployment of renewable energy and other means. And also, as you are aware, there is stress tests being conducted after regular inspections in the context of making a decision to resume existing nuclear power plants operations. There is a vigorous test being introduced. And that's going to be implemented not only by NISA, Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, but the Nuclear Safety Commission, which has not involved itself before in these kind of specific nuclear power plants supervision. And so we are talking about introducing, determining the best energy mix with a medium to long-term scenario as well by the summer of next year. And we are aware of the need to deploy innovation, technological innovations, and our efforts to conserve energy. And next one is a slide. This is, of course, after 3/11, we have received, so many support from over 160 countries and regions, over 40 international organizations. All the countries represented here extended support for Japan after 3/11, and we are so thankful for the support. And Mr. Noda is saying in terms of Japan becoming more active in international efforts for assisting other countries in need, including countries like Thailand or Turkey, or the issue of sending peacekeeping operations engineering units to South Sudan. That's another example. Lastly, I wish to touch upon APEC issues, and there is another PowerPoint related to APEC, and I guess many of you are aware of what is APEC. So I would not get into the details of the discussion. But of course, in the context of APEC, we have very much keen interest in promoting free and open trade and investment at APEC, and APEC should be made open regionalism, not closed. And during the last several years, there has been intensive discussion of a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, FTAP, and we wish to discuss in detail what are the building blocks, how we would achieve free trade area at APEC. And TPP is something which has a potential for leading to eventually the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. But the APEC is not only about the free trade or free trade area. Of course, there are other very important agenda items, including growth and job creation. At the Yokohama APEC summit meetings, we were discussing in terms of the new growth strategies and APEC's strategy for growth. Obviously, APEC is the region where there is the most dynamic economic activities taking place, and more than 50% of the world GDP, 40% of both the world's population, and 50% of global trade. So the discussion taking place at APEC is very important, and this upcoming APEC will be discussing other issues like regulatory reform issues and transparency of regulations and competitiveness issues, energy efficiency and energy security issues. And of course, on the issue of energy efficiency, Japan is the leader in terms of energy efficiency. And if, for example, APEC as a region would arrive at the level of energy efficiency as Japan, it would have a major impact on the global sustainability, as would be related to climate change discussions. So we would be very much interested in discussing those kind of issues, including how we could promote energy efficiency or promoting green growth, as the chair, the President Obama would be emphasizing. And we would be interested in spreading the use of environmental goods or environmentally friendly goods. And we'd be discussing how we could be reducing the burden on the environment in terms of deploying those products and facilitate trade of those products. So I wish to stop here, and I would like to open the floor for questions. And when you ask questions, please identify yourself and with your affiliation. And first, I would just like to open the floor for international journalists. Okay.
Martin Kölling, Financial Times, Germany. Thank you very much. I have maybe two questions. I will start with two questions first. It's somehow related, of course, to TPP. What I wonder is a little bit why the discussion is focusing so much on TPP recently. There are also other free trade areas that are basically, economically speaking, of much more importance than the TPP, like the free trade agreement with ASEAN. So what is the reason that TPP is now so at the front burner, and not maybe later on? Some say this has... No, okay, I'll let you answer this. And yeah, the second question is regarding agricultural reform. This topic is already basically very hot for at least 10 years, but nothing has happened. What is the basic policy of the government in this area? How do you want to push reforms? I don't want to talk about TPP. This is another issue. But actually, what is your time? What is your time frame? What are your strategies in terms of agricultural reform?
if you recall the time of Khan administration, before APEC Yokohama meeting, there was announcements by or decision made by Khan cabinet on the 9th of November, titled Basic Policy on Comprehensive Economic Partnerships. And in this document, which is still basically valid, it says, I quote, Japan will work towards the realization of regional economic partnerships such as China-Japan-Korea FTA, East Asia Free Trade Agreements, which is basically ASEAN plus 3. And you see the last page of the slide that I was discussing as part 1. And comprehensive economic partnership in East Asia, it's called CEPIA, which is ASEAN plus 6, which are being studied at present, and commence EPA negotiations with Mongolia, with which it is now undertaking a joint study as soon as possible. And then it moves on to the issue of TPP in the context of in parallel with improving domestic environments, Japan will actively promote bilateral EPAs with major countries, regions in the Asia-Pacific regions with which Japan has not yet started negotiations. And concerning TPP, the only path to the FTAAP, where negotiations have actually begun, it is necessary to act through gathering further information in Japan while moving expeditiously to improve domestic environment, will commence consultation with the TPP member countries. Japanese position is we are interested in pursuing free trade agreements, or in our terms EPA, economic partnership agreements with major economies, including, for example, EU. And it was during the time of Prime Minister Khan when after he attended the Deauville G8 summit, went to Brussels, and there was agreement between EU and Japan to start the scoping exercise. But there was not agreement reached in terms of launching Japan-EU FTA negotiation. Japan has been saying that we wish to do that, but I don't think at this point of time there is no agreement in terms of launching FTA negotiation. But scoping exercise would be a stepping stone toward launching of FTA negotiation between Japan and EU, and we are very much hopeful for that. And another one is the Japan-Korea-China trilateral FTA. When we had a Japan trilateral summit meeting in May in Japan, we agreed to try to finish joint study among the 3 countries by the end of this year, and try to explore launching negotiation with negotiation of free trade agreement talks among the 3 countries. So we are of the view that we wish to explore different possibilities. But as for TPP, among those the regional agreements, this is the only agreement that is being making progress in terms of text. And this is a matter, the very concrete issue of whether the Japanese government would participate in the ongoing negotiation or not. So I would say that, and also, of course, TPP is aiming at the very high level agreement. And it is very difficult to come up with exclusions. And also, you are talking about WTO plus agreements which are kind of cutting edge in terms of free trade negotiations. So if Japanese government decides to participate in the TPP negotiations, there are obviously many issues that we need to look into, and so because of that, I think there is a very vibrant debate taking place, as you see inside the ruling party. And second question about agricultural policy. Last November, there was an announcement at the same time, around the same time, to promote policy of reviewing Japanese agricultural or fisheries or the food-related policy. And this is something that whether we decide to join TPP negotiation or not, this is something that we should work on. And as you mentioned, that there are emerging problems over years facing Japanese agricultural or fisheries agency industries, and this is something that we are aiming at coming up with a concrete action plan, and we have already been discussing in terms of 7 strategies, including how we could make our agricultural industries competitive. There is potential for Japanese food exports overseas as Japanese food is getting more popular, and how we could, number 2 is how we could make agriculture as a growth industry, and we need to improve our efficiency of distribution. And number 3, and the potential of making use of agriculture in terms of the energy production. And number 4 is revitalization of forests. Number 5 is revitalization of fisheries industries. Number 6 is how we could create infrastructure that is disaster resilient. And number 7 is the linkage between nuclear disaster and agricultural policy. So this is the debate that would be promoted regardless of how our trade policy would develop. But obviously there are some interlinkages between the two. Next question, Petra.
Yes, I'm Petra Kolonko, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I have 2 questions. The first one is concerning the new energy strategy. Could you explain to us what the procedure so far is? Who is involved in the process, and what is the state you've reached so far? And does the discussion also involve matters like breaking the monopoly of the power companies, for example? And the second would be concerning APEC. One of the important meetings the Prime Minister will have is the one with the Chinese president. Could you tell us something about what's going to be on the agenda of that? Thank you.
Okay. Regarding the first question, there is ongoing discussion under the meeting called the Energy and Environment Council. And this is something which is now kind of positioned under the National Policy and Strategy Council. And this council would be, is now conducting, for example, re-evaluation of costs associated with the nuclear power plant generation. There is a view that the nuclear power generation cost estimates did not take into account the potential risks and safety measures and so forth. And this process, which would be focusing on determining the new energy best mix for Japan, this would be something that would be finalized by summer of next year with the midterm scenario planning, like what is going to be our energy mix in the year 2030, and what's the proportion of nuclear power plants or renewable energies, and if you're talking about renewable energies, what is the place of solar or geothermal or wind and so forth. So this is something which needs to involve public. So our plan is there is going to be a kind of intermediate or the draft proposal to be announced by the government at one point of time. And we would be doing a kind of public comments or the engagement with the public, which is going to be probably taking place during the spring of the next year. So this is one major the kind of venue, and there is another the kind of venue that is established in terms of focusing on discussing reform in our power sector, and this relates to some of the issues, including the compensation by TEPCO, or and also rebuilding our nuclear power plant safety measures, and reviewing structure of nuclear power industries, and also more broadly institutional reform of our power sectors. And regarding the question of, say, for example, separation of generation and distribution of the power, those kind of issues, including the modality of nuclear power business, is I assume would be going to be discussed in the context of how we stabilize our demand and supply, how we would manage the cost issues, and how we manage the risk issues, and what are the ideal modality of power business in this country. So this is the kind of issues that would be discussed in the course of this discussion, which is titled the Ministerial Meeting on Power Reform and TEPCO. Any other? Oh, okay. On China, at the G20 meeting, there was a very brief encounter between the two leaders, and they agreed to hold the bilateral meeting in Honolulu. And so Prime Minister Noda is going to be meeting with President Hu Jintao in Honolulu. And we are hoping that Prime Minister Noda will be visiting China in due course, and hopefully, at the early juncture. And we wish to promote ties between the two countries. We have been confirming a basic policy of the promoting the strategic relations of mutual interests, and there are a number of issues that we need to collaborate, not only in bilateral terms, but also other issues, including, as I mentioned, say, promoting FTA or EPA, among the three countries or ASEAN +3 or other regional and global issues. So if there are no other questions from journalists, I would just open the floor for questions from the embassy people. Anybody? Yeah.
Discussed with China. Do you think that the last visit of Dalai Lama will have a negative impact in the relation between China and Japan? And it is possible that the visit of Premier Minister Noda can be cancelled?
I don't think the visit of Mr. Dalai Lama has any kind of significant bearings or impacts on our basic relations between the two countries or the Prime Minister's visit to China. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir. I am working at the European Union delegation. I would like to know if you have some information to give us about the preparation of the East Asia Summit in Bali, if there is some issues that your government would like to push. Thank you.
Okay. Of course, this year we are seeing the participation of the United States and Russia as the kind of a new participants in the East Asian Summit. This East Asian Summit is not only about East Asia. We are planning to, Prime Minister Noda is planning to hold meetings with between Japan and ASEAN summit meeting, ASEAN +3 summit meetings, and East Asian summit meeting, as well as Japan Mekong summit meeting. So we would have a series of the meetings. The Prime Minister is engaging with the leaders. And in terms of Japan-ASEAN summit meetings, we have been interested in assisting the improvement of connectivity in the region. And as you know, ASEAN is aiming at coming up with the kind of a common, how they call it, community, right? ASEAN community by 2015. And we wish to support connectivity of the region and also assisting the kind of capacity buildings in terms of, for example, coping with disasters. And this is something that we have been interested in terms of disaster-related collaboration. And we know that there is efforts on the side of ASEAN to establish network in the area of disaster prevention and response. So these are the kind of issues that we would be discussing, and of course we have some of the common agendas, including the ocean security issues, or promoting the regional collaboration in terms of the food security or the environment, and those kind of issues. And as for East Asia summits, I think there is a good interest among the East Asian summit participants in terms of promoting discussion of the kind of ocean-related issues, including how we would promote kind of basic rules associated with the ocean in terms of ensuring freedom of navigations and so forth. And also this disaster issue is again on the agenda. And of course there is the process focusing on democracy. There is a Bali Democracy Forum, and we wish to support the sharing of democratic values among the member countries, for example. And and lastly, ASEAN +3. There is a connection between, say, FTA discussion among Japan, Korea, China, because those three countries have already FTA with ASEAN. So if those three countries are connected, there's a potential for linking them all together. So there is a potential for ASEAN +3 FTA being promoted, and this reflects pretty much the kind of supply chains being emerging in Asian market. So these are some of the issues, and of course Mekong regions is something that we have been paying particular attention to, and in terms of coming up with regional connectivity, there are more challenges in the region, and we are engaging in individual countries, but at the same time, we have our view of, we are taking into account the regional perspective as we collaborate with Mekong countries. Next questions.
Hello, I'm from the Xinhua News Agency. I have two questions. The first one is, I know there is a military exercise which is held in Kyushu. Some experts said it is focused on China. What will you explain of that? And second question is, do you think there will be some cooperations between Japan and China when dealing with the European financial crisis? Thank you.
On the issue of the exercises, this is something that we conduct regularly, and as you are aware, Japan has been maintaining rather minimum kind of defense posture, and our defense budgets under the very difficult, the fiscal situations has not been increasing, and at the same time, we are not, talking about any kind of potential, threats or anything, and it is the kind of regular exercises that are necessary for our self-defense forces, to have preparedness. And on the issue of the European, financial situations, of course, this is something that needs to be at first addressed by our European friends, and Japan is very much interested in extending collaboration, but I think the primary contacts need to be made between, for example, from our side, Japan, and European authorities, and we wish to know what are the concrete schemes being emerging, and how we could extend assistance as appropriate. So there could be exchange of views between Japan and China, but if those kind of issues are becoming more multilateral in nature, this is the kind of subjects that we would be discussing in the context of IMF, and as I mentioned at the outset, we are of the view that there should be a combination of different approaches, including bilateral, as we do between Japan and the Eurozone counterparts, and there are potential for regional collaboration, and in the context of this specific issues, IMF's role is very important in not only focusing on Eurozone issues, but I'm talking more globally about how we would be prepared, for better prepared for different the the events that could be taking place. Any other questions? Okay.
Martin Kölling, again, maybe a follow-up to this question. I think Prime Minister Noda also talked about trying to avoid that basically the European crisis affects Asia. Or do you think what is the view of the Japanese government of a more Asian approach? If you want to immunize Asia against the fallout of a debt crisis, wouldn't it be advisable or that you have a cooperation, that you are strengthening an Asian framework? And what is the view of the government in this regard?
The lessons that we have based on the Asian financial crisis in 1997, there was a initiative called Chiang Mai Initiative that was promoted, and this rather focused on currency swaps, establishing currency swaps, and if one member country is in need, there is a swap arrangement to be made. And as I said that at the outset, between Japan and Korea, we recently agreed to expand that swap arrangement between the two countries. Basically, this Chiang Mai Initiative, as I understand, is a kind of a compilation of different bilateral, swap arrangements between the member countries. On the issue of contagion, if we see the kind of real risk of contagion from Eurozone to outside the regions and potentially the emerging economies, that would be damaging for the global economy. And we are of the view that, for example, those emerging economies that have been implementing healthy economic policy stance, but because of, say, for example, contagion, if those countries are starting to suffer, there's legitimate reason to help out. And under those kind of circumstances, institutions like IMF could help those countries. So I touched upon a few issues that may be relevant to your question. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Can I ask you why Prime Minister Noda postponed his press conference? It doesn't look very good.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you are aware, we did not come up with a specific time, for press conference, and we were expecting, that there's a possibility of press conference yesterday, and as I understand, after listening to the viewpoints of three major leaders of DPJ, who were engaged in the discussion inside the party, Prime Minister himself decided, that he wishes to, think one more day. So, although there is no press conference set, as I was aware before, I left the Prime Minister's office. I'm, thinking that he would be holding a press conference, hopefully, today. So this is a matter of a grave, importance, and he wanted to think hard regarding what kind of announcement he would make.
Otherwise, what's your guess on joining TPP or not joining TPP?
Excuse me?
I have to repeat. What do you guess about Japanese I mean, Japan joining TPP or not joining? Your guess.
Guess, okay. It's a bit difficult for me to come up with a guess. Actually, I would say that Prime Minister, he is attending the budget committee meetings, and I don't think he has indicated his conclusions at this point of time. And I'm not really in a position to go beyond what Prime Minister is saying. But he has been saying that Japan needs to participate in high-level economic partnership (FTA), and this is something. And in the context of the Asia-Pacific region, this is a vibrant economic growth center, and Japan would benefit, from those kind of, high-level economic agreements in the region. But he has not said anything about his decision to participate in TPP at this juncture. So please stay tuned. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for coming.